Hello, everyone. I'm Beth Angel. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work, and I am delighted to welcome you to part 2 of the 2024 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture. Yesterday, Dr. Karen Lincoln discussed brain clearance system alteration and cognitive decline in African Americans with poor sleep quality. And today we are delighted to have Dr. Jennifer Manley join us to discuss redefining healthy brain aging to reveal pathways to equity in later life cognition and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So we have a really wonderful theme this year, uniting topics around cognition and aging that I think are going to be very enlightening for all of us. Before we begin today, I want to just share with you some of this lecture series history. Josephine Winkelman was a 1919 graduate of the University of Michigan social work program, and she worked at the Hull House, which is a settlement house, a well-known settlement house in Chicago. Her husband, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman Stores in Detroit with his brother Isidore in 1928. Their son Stanley was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit and deeply involved in social justice issues in the city. In 1978, the Leon and Josephine Memorial Lecture was created here at the school through an endowed gift from Stanley and his brothers as a tribute to their parents. The lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and helping professions in the field of gerontology. The lecture also provides an opportunity to discuss the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, to the organization and management of social welfare services, and the delivery of social work services. We're so grateful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides an opportunity to honor our alumna, Josephine Winkelman, and her husband, Leon. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Robert Joseph Taylor, who will serve as our moderator today. Dr. Taylor is the Harold R. Johnson Endowed Professor of Social Work and the Sheila Feld Collegiate Professor of Social Work. Dr. Taylor is an esteemed and influential researcher who has published extensively on the informal social support networks, which includes families, friends, and church members of adult and elderly Black Americans. He has been a co-principal investigator on several National Institute of Mental Health grants on the correlation of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans. Dr. Taylor's influence goes beyond research. His leadership has directly impacted and encouraged a generation of social work scholars. He is the principal investigator of the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research and the director of the Program of Research on Black Americans. Those two programs host a summer mentoring workshop, which Dr. Taylor has directed since its inception in 1998. In 2021, Dr. Taylor received the inaugural James Jackson Outstanding Mentorship Award from the Gerontological Society of America. And as we recently learned, he was named as one of Elsevier's top 2% of the world's most cited researchers. So with that, I will place our program into the capable hands of Dr. Robert Joseph Taylor.
Thank you. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Manley. Dr. Manley is a professor of neuropsychology in the Department of Neurology at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Her research focuses on mechanisms of disparities in cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease, specifically investigations of social forces across a life course, such as educational opportunities, racism, discrimination, and socioeconomic status, and also how these factors relate to cognition and brain health in later life. Her research team has partnered with Black and Latinx communities in New York City and around the United States. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, as well as the Alzheimer's Association. She has authored over 300 peer-reviewed publications. She has been the recipient of several career mentoring awards, and I could easily argue she is one of the top 2 to 3 African American researchers who do work on cognitive aging among African Americans. And in 2021, she was elected to be a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So please welcome Dr. Jennifer Manley.
Thanks very much, Professor Taylor, and to the Dean for inviting me to do this lecture. I'm going to, it's really an honor. I'm going to share my slides now. And hopefully all of you are seeing my title slide. So let's get started. I first want to thank my colleagues who helped me with this research and the grants that fund some of the work I'll be showing you, and sort of my career and my research team. Other than these NIH grants, I don't have any relevant disclosures. So let's talk about dementia in the United States. Right now, probably most of you know that dementia is the 5th leading cause of death worldwide. And in fact, by 2028, the cost of dementia care, that includes medical and formal and informal caregiving costs, will be greater than $2 trillion US dollars worldwide. So what are the best data that we have about racial and ethnic inequalities in dementia and Alzheimer's disease? You probably heard a little bit about this yesterday from Professor Lincoln. I'm going to show you a study that was done in California using the Kaiser Permanente Northern California data, which is a large integrated healthcare delivery system. In that healthcare system, what Elizabeth Rose Maeda, who is pictured there on the right, and her colleagues did was they selected only members aged 60 years and older, and they compared incident cases of dementia, all subtypes of dementia, according to medical records. They found that Asian Americans were least likely to develop dementia, and they had, in other words, Asian Americans had the lowest risk among all of the groups studied in the Kaiser study. And therefore, the Asian American group was set as the reference group. They found that compared to Asian Americans, African Americans were 65% more likely to develop dementia. And American Indians and Alaska Natives were 32% more likely than Asian Americans to develop dementia. So let's go to the next slide, which is one of our fun questions of the day. And it is about the study I just showed you. And the question is, which racialized group had the lowest risk of incident dementia in the Maeda 2016 paper that I just showed you that was using the Kaiser cohort? I'm just going to wait a second while people answer. I know that there are now around 60. Oh, there's 87 of you. So I'm going to wait until we have maybe 90% participation or so. Okay, last chance to answer our question. All right, so let's end the poll and maybe we'll show the results. I don't know if y'all are seeing this. I'm seeing it, that most people answered Asian Americans, and that's correct. In the California study, they found that Asian Americans were at the lowest risk of developing dementia among all the groups studied. And the reason why I wanted to show you that paper is that so rarely are all of these groups able to be included at the same time. Northern California is really a diverse place, and they were able to follow these folks over time because most people who work in Northern California have Kaiser insurance. And so this is really a big advantage of this study. So why are there disparities in dementia and Alzheimer's disease? What is the cause of disparities? Like all health inequalities, the underlying reasons for these disparities are due to systemic differences in the opportunities that groups have to achieve optimal health. These differences are unfair and they are avoidable, and therefore the cause of these differences are modifiable. So what do we know about modifiable risk factors for dementia? Things that we can do, either things that we can change, things that we can add or subtract to exposures that happen during life that can reduce risks for dementia. Well, first, there's a very well publicized study about modifiable risk factors. It was done by Gil Livingston in 2020, and I'm showing you the now very famous figure from this study. Basically, what it does, it shows life course modifiable risks. So in the beginning of life, in early life, they cite that people who have low education are at higher risk for developing dementia, and that this basically the 7% that you see in this green bubble here by low education is the percentage reduction in dementia prevalence that would happen if this risk factor were to be eliminated. So that the size of that bubble and the number there depends on how common the risk factor is, and also the strength of its impact on later life dementia risk. So they go throughout life, they talk about midlife, and they cite hearing loss, traumatic brain injury. In later life, they talk about smoking, depression, and social isolation as being additional risk factors that pop up during that life course period that are modifiable, and if eliminated, could reduce the dementia prevalence. And overall, at the end, they cite that about 40% of dementia risk could be reduced if we were to intervene on the modifiable risk factors that they came up with. So how did they come up with these factors? It was through essentially a literature review or systematic literature review. It suggests that there's a tremendous amount that we can do to preserve cognitive health, but you should also know that the data that these are based on are almost entirely data from high-income countries, and above that, among white, well-educated people in high-income countries. So that is a potential limitation of this now very popular, highly cited paper on modifiable risk factors. Let's go to our next question. What risk factor for Alzheimer's disease was not identified as modifiable in the systematic review by Livingston et al., their paper, which was in 2020 in The Lancet? Was it smoking? Was it low education? Was it chronological age? Or was it social isolation? Pick the risk factor that was not identified as modifiable. Okay, last chance to reply. Hopefully everyone is getting a chance to do it. Okay, let's end our poll. I think most people have responded. And most people responded correctly. So chronological age is not modifiable. And so it was not, even though it is the risk factor that's most associated with getting dementia, it's not a modifiable risk factor. So that's what the paper was about. It was about modifiable risk factors. Cool. So let's move on. And many of you know this from seeing, stories in the paper or studies in the journals, that the state of genetic studies overall is largely people who are European or European American ancestry. And that is certainly true of Alzheimer's disease studies. So this pie chart basically shows the proportion of people across different ancestry groups who have been included in genetic studies of Alzheimer's disease as of 2022. Again, this was a systematic review, and basically shows that or suggests that the lack of inclusion and diversity in Alzheimer's disease research, especially genetic, but in other types too that we'll talk about, it really threatens innovation and also effective treatment. So that is really a threat to what we know about healthy brain aging, is that most of the research is based on a tiny, narrow population of the world. That also affects drug trials. So again, this is relatively recent. There have been 3 sort of drugs that are amyloid antibody drugs. They are administered via infusion, and people who have participated in these trials, the drug trials of drugs like donanemab, that was the most recent drug that was the effects in a randomized controlled trial were published. It's very effective at eliminating its target. So that's amyloid, cerebral amyloid in the brain. That's one of the proteins that's thought to contribute to Alzheimer's disease. But the clinical effect, even though amyloid was completely gone from the brain after treatment with this drug, the clinical effect was comparatively weak. So by the end of the trial, which was 76 weeks, amyloid plaques were cleared in 80% of the treatment group. Overall, cognition and daily function continued to decline in all participants, whether they were in treatment with donanemab or whether they were in the placebo group. And treatment with donanemab on the primary outcome, which was this Alzheimer's disease rating scale, was delayed. Decline was delayed by about 4 months only. So they were treated for 76 weeks, amyloid's gone, and then the effect was a delay in decline by about 4 months on average. Now, I'm showing you the demographics of the trial, which are very similar to the demographics of the genetic studies that I just showed you. 92% white. Of those randomized to treatment with donanemab, only 19 were Black. Only 2 were American Indian Alaska Natives, and there were only 8 Asian people from the US who were randomized into the treatment. So we're basing our knowledge about what this drug does in these populations on teeny tiny groups of people. All drug trials try to come up with these subgroup analyses. And this is the table. It's buried very deep into the paper, in the supplement of the paper. It's figure 9, and shows that the only groups that showed point estimates for percent slowing that were consistent with acceleration or more rapid cognitive and functional decline in the treatment group of donanemab were those racialized as Black, and also those racialized as Hispanic. But the precision of the results, you can see here, they overlap 0. And so the precision of the results was low because there's not enough people in those groups to know for sure what's going on. So my point in showing you this here is, I think, a little scary, that the 2 subgroups that showed more rapid decline in memory loss and functional loss on these Alzheimer's drugs are Black people and Hispanic people, but that because the trial was not inclusive, we can't make definitive statements about it. But the more important underlying thing is that safety and efficacy is just not being established by these drug trials in minoritized groups. So why is it that we have so few Black and Latinx people in these trials? Casey Dieters showed in a similar study that it's that in part it's the cutoff criteria. So in these trials, you have to have some cognitive impairment, but not too much. And because it's an amyloid busting drug, you have to have amyloid in your brain. And what this relatively complicated table shows, I'm just going to summarize it for you, is that in the first screening point of screening, where you have to check to see if people don't have too severe of cognitive impairment, Black respondents who were volunteers for the trial obtained lower scores on the cognitive measures, and they were screened out more often than white respondents for that reason. And then in the second screening step, the Black people who were left over after that initial screening were less likely to have amyloid in their brain. And so they were screened out for that reason as well. Let me show you another study that basically says the same thing, but it's now 4 modern AD trials that were again required people to have amyloid in their brain, but also required their cognitive test scores to be above a certain level. They couldn't be demented if they were in the trial. So they required cognitive test scores above a certain level. Again, when they compared people by race and ethnicity, they found that the non-Hispanic Black participants were less likely to be able to participate. They were, quote, screen fails because they were less likely to have amyloid in their brain after they were screened out because of these cognitive test scores. So essentially, Black and in this case, Asian people were less likely to qualify for these trials. And the author said it's because they have lower rates of biomarker confirmed Alzheimer's disease. But hold that thought, because I want you to have a healthy sense of skepticism about whether there really are racial and ethnic differences in biomarkers, or if there's something going on with these screens that makes it unfair. So how did we get to this point where we have such lopsided Alzheimer's disease research? In 1984, the National Institute on Aging acknowledged the need to establish Alzheimer's disease research centers at numerous academic institutions across the country. And the idea that these centers would be local hubs of expertise, that they would support projects and would inspire and recruit new research to do Alzheimer's disease research, that these hubs would be interdisciplinary. In doing so, the growth of the field of Alzheimer's disease research was conditioned on having expertise, tools, and volunteers to validate the presence of Alzheimer's disease using what turned out to be very detailed research criteria. I'm going to show you in the next slide where these new ADRCs were and essentially still are located, but I just want to make the point that even though race is not mentioned in any of the research criteria for AD, there are no different criteria by race, the criteria for Alzheimer's disease are racialized. And this is because of the history of these centers, in part. Most of the scientists are white. The research centers and studies are mostly accessible to white people. All of the neuropsych and functional measures are validated on white people. This situation really lacks generalizability to the rest of the world, but it also risks conflating features of the disease with features of this overwhelming context of whiteness and privilege. Basically, what it has done is baked in features of whiteness into what we think we know about Alzheimer's disease. So all of those criteria that I mentioned to you before, the criteria for being in an Alzheimer's disease trial, are based on this history, this legacy of Alzheimer's disease research in these very narrow groups of people who had access to these, quote, elite Alzheimer's disease centers around the country. So another aspect of this is our place on research teams. In precision medicine research, there's someone at Columbia named Sandra Sujin Lee. She's found that research team members report they are selectively and disproportionately hired into frontline research staff positions, but not into leadership or management positions. They're often viewed as experts on diversity only and perceive limited opportunities for upward mobility and to contributing to other dimensions of their expertise. So in their experience, the existing hierarchies and power structures are compounding challenges to the equitable diversification of research teams. And even though her work is on precision medicine research, you can see how this has applied to Alzheimer's disease research, particularly because we tend to put our trainees and early career folks from minoritized backgrounds in these limited frontline research staff in outreach positions in our research. So let me show you the map that I promised you, this overlap between county level prevalence of Alzheimer's disease, which is shown in the colorful blocks that you see throughout the map, and then the locations, which are the circles of these NIA-funded Alzheimer's disease research centers, these hubs for Alzheimer's disease research. And you can see where there are some really huge gaps between sort of county level prevalence of Alzheimer's disease and these resources, especially in the Deep South. So let's go back to Elizabeth Rose Maeda and her study. Let's go back to these inequalities, and I've basically shown you some of the issues that Alzheimer's disease research traditionally has in properly finding some of the causes for these inequalities. Let's go to a model, a conceptual model that I think will help us, frame the rest of our research so that we can investigate properly these disparities. I'm going to start by just saying that the basis of this model is to evaluate sources of inequalities, to develop strategies for narrowing them. The goal is to extend cognitive life expectancy for all and minimize disability due to cognitive impairment. And this demands a life course perspective, much like all inequality or disparities research in health. Let's start with the most proximal causes of dementia. We know that Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia are thought to be the most common dementia subtypes in the US. And here, what I'm showing you is some of the neuropathologies that we can find in the brain: amyloid, I already mentioned, tau, TDP-43, cerebrovascular disease, and neuroinflammation. They lead to neurodegeneration, which is the most proximal point to decline in cognitive function and dementia. So what do we see in what can we see sort of in the clinic and when people volunteer for research studies? Let's go back in time a little more distal or upstream and talk about risk factors for these neuropathologies. It includes genetics, but also other chronic diseases, and also takes into account healthcare access. You see now race and ethnicity popping up as something that is thought to be associated with higher or lower risk for cognitive function and dementia. But we need to move back in time even more and discuss social determinants. So before all of these, health behaviors and health conditions, and even feeding into race, ethnicity. Race is made. It's shaped by historical, political, economic, and cultural forces, and that's what I'm trying to establish there with the arrows that go into race and ethnicity. Early life and adult social inequalities are some of the structural and social determinants of health that influence cognitive function through these other mediators. And then finally, we have historical and contemporary systems of oppression that are the precursors for structural and social determinants of health, like poverty, like neighborhood conditions, like income inequality, like residential segregation. These are the drivers, both discriminatory beliefs and institutional power. I have birth year here because it depends, one's exposure to these things depends on when in time you were born. And there certainly are some intersectional factors to take into account. But these historical and contemporary systems of oppression feed into how race is made and these social and structural determinants. The red arrows, what are they there for? They are showing that structural and social determinants of health can buffer or exacerbate risk. And that in particular, there are people who have a lot of neuropathology in their brain, but do not have cognitive decline. And we think that social and structural factors allow people to have more resilience or more reserve against these neuropathologies. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So that I think I want you to keep in your head as the model. Inclusive Alzheimer's disease research has some challenges and opportunities. I'm going to go through some of them moving forward, but I wanted to just give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about. How do we design Alzheimer's disease research so this framework can be properly evaluated? Starting in 1992, there was a study that took place in Washington Heights, which is in northern Manhattan. The epidemiology of dementia at that time among minoritized communities in the US was unknown. So this is prior to that Kaiser study. Basically, we took Medicare eligible people who were in the census tracts around Columbia University Hospital and followed them over time. We did in-home evaluations, and the evaluation was very similar to what folks would get if they came into the neurologist, if they came into the dementia specialist. One of the core findings of this research is that there were racial inequalities in dementia risk, not unlike what Elizabeth Rose Maeda found in the Kaiser cohort several years later. And one of the keys to success to this study was first, developing trust and partnership within the community, because a house-to-house survey was too expensive, finding that target population, the Medicare eligible people in the census tracts around the hospital, so that it was a representative group. Doing home visits was another key to success. We found evidence for age of leveler effects, and that's shown on the right over here. By age 65, disparities in cognition, this is memory here on the y-axis, disparities in cognition were already wide at age 65 and were as wide as they would ever be because of selective survival. The disparities narrowed as people got older. In other words, Black people with more cognitive impairment are less likely to survive into later age than are white people with cognitive impairment. We also had to face and overcome measurement bias in the cognitive tests. With partnership of the community in Washington Heights, we were able to investigate sources of inequality in dementia and cognitive aging, found things like some of these sources of inequalities were poverty in childhood, illiteracy, low investment in schools, early life schooling, childhood residence in the South among Black participants, among the Latinx Participants, people who were born and raised in the Dominican Republic, were more likely to develop cognitive impairment and dementia, especially compared to people who were born and raised in Cuba, which was protective. Adult residents in racially segregated neighborhoods was another risk factor that we uncovered using this study. So let's go back to that question that I raised earlier about whether there are racial and ethnic differences in these Alzheimer's disease biomarkers and lead to sort of what we know about the biological pathways. This is a study of 300 people, 100 from each of the three major racial and ethnic groups in the YCAP study. Their blood was drawn at the time of the diagnostic visit, and their Alzheimer's disease diagnosis was made by a consensus panel that reviewed all the data that we had, but did not consider biomarker concentrations. And basically what this is showing in the total sample, which is A, the white, Black, and Hispanic participants, which is B, C, and D panels, that levels of amyloid and tau, which are these key proteins in Alzheimer's disease, were not reliably different across race and ethnicity. The biomarker that best distinguished between those who had a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease versus normal cognition was p-tau 217. But as you can see here, these ROC curves, for anybody who's used to seeing ROC curves, the area under the curve is really not very impressive at all. And partly that's, the emphasis of these biomarkers has been in clinical samples and not in population-based samples. And so when you look at how good these biomarkers are at distinguishing diagnoses, it's really, misleading to base it on clinical samples. We have also recruited an additional cohort of about 2,000 of the adult children of those older adults in YCAP. Their mean age when they had those biomarkers taken was about 76 years old. For the offspring, their mean age is about 55. So they're about 20 years later, younger at baseline on average. And again, I'm showing you neurofilament light, GFAP, which is another one of these neurodegeneration biomarkers, tau, and also A beta. There are no racial and ethnic differences in these biomarkers in the younger offspring as well. So some people out there in the literature, and I showed you some of those studies before, think that we should use different biomarker cutoffs by race in order to diagnose people with biological Alzheimer's disease. But when you do a more representative sampling, you do not see this. So that's something important to know. But I do want to show you some differences that we've started to see, and that is the relationship of some of these biomarkers with memory does differ across race and ethnicity. Overall, the higher levels of neurofilament light, which is a blood-based biomarker of neurodegeneration, the higher your NFL, the higher your neurodegeneration levels, the lower your performance on measures of delayed memory, which is on the y-axis here, delayed memory. You can see the direction. The higher levels of NFL, lower memory. But you can see that the relationship is strongest in the white people in our study. That is this blue line here up on top here, compared to the Black and Latinx people in the cohort. So at lower levels of NFL, there seem to be other factors that are affecting the performance of Black and Latinx participants. At higher levels of NFL, everyone's performance seems to be pulled down. So let's talk about other biomarkers that might help us get a sense of what's going on in the brain. We have markers of biological aging as opposed to chronological age. These are these biological clocks that many of you have heard about. Clock ages that are older than the chronological age of the person being measured indicate an advanced state of biological aging, and younger clock ages indicate delayed aging. Using data from the Health and Retirement Study, Gloria Graf and Dan Belsky found that 4 DNA methylation clocks showed evidence of more or advanced biological aging in Black participants compared to white participants. And these differences in biological age accounted for 13 to 95% of Black-white differences in health span related characteristics. So in other words, Black Americans were biologically older and were aging more rapidly than white Americans of the same chronological age. Associations of biological aging measures with memory trajectories were consistent not only in white people, but also in Black and Latinx, but not in Black and Latinx people. And this was shown by Justina Avila-Rieger in my group. So older adults with lower socioeconomic status had accelerated biological aging, even though these SES biological aging associations were strongest for white men and women and weakest for Latinx women. Let's go on to other biological markers of Alzheimer's disease. First, markers of cerebrovascular disease. If you have these white matter hyperintensities in your brain, it is not good. This is how our group, Adam Brickman in particular, who does MRI imaging in the YCAP study and the offspring study, quantifies white matter hyperintensities in the brain. They're often sort of located around the ventricles of the brain. And what Indira Turney found when she examined the relationship of age to white matter hyperintensities in the YCAP cohort, the older adults, and the offspring cohort, the younger adults, is that there was an inflection point in later age where there was an increase in white matter hyperintensity volume, and that it appeared to accelerate in the people who were racialized as white. You see this inflection point here with age, around age 65 or so. And there was an inflection point for the Latinx participants as well, comparing the slope of age in the younger group compared to the older group. But if you look at in the Black participants in the middle here, you don't see that inflection point. In other words, the relationship of age is the same to white matter hyperintensity volume in the younger Black participants and the older Black participants. And Indira interpreted these findings as evidence of so-called weathering or accelerated brain aging. The cumulative impact of structural racism and the social, physical, and economic adversity faced by Black people in our study was embodied biologically, particularly in this brain aging measure. She also found it using a indicator of cortical thickness, which is really the added sort of number that is sort of measured by the difference in the cortical thickness, which is this difference between the yellow area of the brain and the red sort of outline of the brain there. And you can see again, she found this inflection point in the relationship of age to cortical thickness in white people and Latinx people, but it's not there in the Black people, again, indicating this weathering idea. Let's move to discuss some of the racially patterned life course social factors that are found to influence disparities. I'm first going to talk about place of birth. This study by Maria Gleamore looked at death certificates from every state in the United States. States with darker colors had higher prevalence of dementia listed as a contributing cause of death. Overall, Black people who are on the left side of our figure, this here is for Alzheimer's, this here is for all-cause dementia. Black people were more likely to have dementia than white people, but regardless of race, people who were born in stroke belt states were associated, that was associated with higher risk of dementia regardless of race. And I just want you to note that this is state of birth, not state of death. So a lot of people migrated from the stroke belt states up north, so they took their childhood risk with them. Okay, I know it's been a while. We're going to do our fun question. Now, people racialized as Black who were born in so-called stroke belt states are at higher risk of dementia than Black people born in non-stroke belt states. What do you think? All right, I'm gonna end the poll. Most of you were right. The vast majority of you were right. That is a true statement. People racialized as Black who were born in stroke belt states were at higher risk of dementia than Black people born in non-stroke belt states. Okay, so how do we look at this? How do we look at this sort of place-based and also racial difference in risk? It's starting to suggest there might be some other things going on here that dig deeper. Why is it that stroke belt states are higher risk for dementia? We can do this with the regard study. It allows us to look at policy changes across the United States as natural experiments that offer the opportunity to establish causal links. And we've done this looking at educational quality. We dug into historical records of county and state level investments in schooling. Those were represented by length of school year, how long the school year was open, how long the school was open, student teacher ratio, so how big are the classrooms, and percent attendance. And there are massive differences across race, both before, certainly before, but also after Brown versus Board of Education, racial differences in these investments that are detailed in these historical records. So let me show you some of that. This is all elementary school data. If you are Black and educated in South Carolina, your school year was, in many cases, less than half the time that open, less than half the time than schools in the North. You see New York in the Black up on top over here, and also white schools in the same state. That was length of school year and student teacher ratio the same. So again, this is elementary school classroom. Black children in South Carolina were sharing their classroom with 40, 50 other children for one teacher. And that was very different for children who attended school in New York, regardless of race, and also white children who were in those states. So those are some of the disparities that we have found in these historical data. And we actually then tied that to each individual in regards. We were able to include almost 20,000 people in the regard study that I showed you before, where those people live. They oversampled the stroke belt and they oversampled Black people. In this analysis, higher investment in elementary school was associated with lower risk of cognitive impairment later in life. The effect was strongest in white people, especially white women. I just want you to see that the benefit of school quality was much lower among Black people in general, especially among Black men. And we think that racism in schools and the labor market serve to counteract the benefits of schooling for Black Americans, particularly for Black men. I call that the Derek Hamilton effect. I don't know, his face just pops up in my head whenever I think about that. What are the dimensions of schooling in particular that can reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease? We did this study in the Project Talent data set, which was a study of 377,000 people who were in US high schools in 1960. Every student in each school selected was a participant in 2 days of testing. This included personality, knowledge, and cognitive ability data and demographic questions. And then 58 years later, the Project Talent Aging Study tracked 22,000 of these people. So this is a school-based cohort. Nika Seblova, who was my postdoc at the time, developed indicators of high school quality that were reported by principals at the time of schooling in 1960. And it turns out they were predictors of cognitive function 58 years later. Essentially, teacher salaries, school size, and number of teachers with graduate training. We found that attending schools with higher numbers of teachers with graduate training was the clearest predictor of later life cognition, and school quality mattered, especially for language abilities. Teacher salary and school size had a larger impact among women in project talent instead of men. And then Black respondents were disproportionately exposed to low quality high schools using these indicators. Therefore, increased investment in schools, especially those that serve Black children, could be a powerful strategy to improve later life cognitive health among older adults in the United States. Here we have our next question. Ways to measure historical investments in schools that serve Black children include, is it per pupil expenditures, teacher salaries, attendance ratios, length of school year, or all of the above? Okay, last chance. We're going to end the poll now. Yes, all of the above were indicators of investments, historical investments in schooling for both Black and white children, for that matter. Okay, so these are my last sort of set of data slides. And what we did was we wanted to measure exposure to multiple levels of racism in the lives of the offspring participants. So remember, these are people in midlife, around age 55. And we use multiple measures to do that. Experiences of daily interpersonal racism were measured by the Everyday Discrimination Scale. We created a chronicity score, combining reported items and their frequency. And this chart shows non-Latinx Black participants in orange had the highest mean exposure to daily racism, compared to Latinx participants in purple and white people in gray. On average, Black participants in the offspring cohort experienced interpersonal discrimination at least once every week. And just note that participants were much more likely, if they were Black, they were much more likely to attribute these experiences of discrimination to be related to their race, ancestry, or skin color than were the Latinx people. This is in New York City, and white people. Similarly, we combined reports of occurrence and frequency on the major discrimination scale to measure institutional racism. And as the second bar chart shows here on the slide, non-Latinx Black people experienced almost 6 civil rights violations on average in their lifetime. And then finally, we knew that racism, as we all know, is maintained by policies and other structural factors institutionally. To represent this, we included a measure of residential segregation during childhood. We knew this because we have recruited these people from their parents. So we knew where their parents lived when they were children. And we were able to show that at least half of the Black and Latinx participants lived in segregated neighborhoods during childhood. In contrast, only about 8% of non-Hispanic white and participants in the sample lived in segregated neighborhoods. So we used linear regression models adjusted for age and education to compare the relationships between interpersonal racism and performance on memory tasks. This plot shows beta estimates and confidence intervals for this relationship in the overall sample, which is in the Black, the negative 0.035 here, and for the racial and ethnic groups. For each of these charts I'm going to show you, we're also showing the relationship of age to memory for comparison. So we found reliable relationships between daily experiences of racism and lower memory in the whole sample. The association of interpersonal racism to memory corresponds to 3 years of chronological age, and it was driven by the non-Hispanic Black participants in the sample. This plot has the same layout. This time I'm showing you the relationship of institutional racism with delayed memory. There was a reliable relationship between institutional racism and memory scores among Black participants, such that each reported civil rights violation corresponds to the effect of about 4.5 years of age on memory. And finally, participants who lived in more racially and ethnically segregated neighborhoods when they grew up had lower delayed memory scores. This was true in the entire sample, but you can see that when we stratified the analysis by group, the relationships were imprecise. So how do we talk to our participants about and our patients and our families about Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease care? The costs as we know, to dementia are very high, but how should we, as brain health advocates in the clinical and research realm, communicate with people about the potential benefits of any treatment or intervention or participation in research, that any treatments that's approved now or that will become available down the road? And I just want to highlight two studies. One of them, the affiliation of the author is not there anymore, but I'm going to tell you in a minute. Tanisha Hill-Garrett examined about 1,500 middle-aged participants in the health and retirement study. And they were asked about their interest in receiving free testing that could determine whether they would develop Alzheimer's disease in the future. Most of the participants, about 55%, experienced everyday discrimination in at least one domain. Those interested in predictive testing were younger and more likely to be Black or Latinx than participants uninterested in testing. And the probability of wanting an Alzheimer's disease test was not associated with discrimination for Black and Latinx participants. So if this is the case, why are Black and Latinx individuals underrepresented in Alzheimer's disease research? What Tanisha found was that past experiences of discrimination do not cause participation or interest gaps across the board. What she showed us, what I love this study for, is that essentially she's reframing the problem for us with this work, placing the ball in our court, not blaming minoritized patients or participants on their lack of interest or knowledge. Essentially, us as providers and researchers need to create equitable access and eliminate barriers to participation for Black and Latinx patients. The second study I'm just showing you on the left is by economist Marcella Aslan, and I'm sorry her name is not down there anymore, but it raises the question about who delivers health information to people who are traditionally underrepresented. And I'm taking it, even though Alzheimer's disease diagnostic testing was not part of this study, I'm taking it to have implications for Alzheimer's disease research. She conducted a study among Black men in Oakland. They were assigned randomly to either Black or non-Black male medical doctors, and they assessed medical decision-making both before and after interacting with their assigned physician. The Black men who were randomly assigned to have a Black doctor were more likely to choose getting preventative services like a flu shot, BMI measurement, blood pressure measurement, diabetes screening, cholesterol screening. Essentially, what this work speaks to me is that in order to become a field that can achieve equity, having a workforce that reflects the populations that we need to serve, especially populations that experience disparities, is paramount. Okay, let's talk about Tanisha's study. Tanisha Hill-Garrett in 2024 found that among Black and Latinx participants in the HRS, experiences of discrimination reduced interest in receiving free testing that could determine whether they would develop Alzheimer's disease in the future. Okay, I can see the poll, and this is turning out to be really interesting. So let's get everybody to finish this last question. I believe it is the last question. And then we will end with some conclusions. Did Hill-Garrett find that discrimination reduced interest in receiving free testing? Let's end the poll. So this one is false. And most of you all said true. So it does actually go against sort of what you might think. And that's the beauty of this study. She actually found that experiences of discrimination were not related to interest in receiving free testing among Black and Latinx participants in HRS. Okay, so let's conclude, and then we have a little bit of time for questions. First, the most informative research on mechanisms of dementia disparities is not from convenient samples. I think I've shown you some really good examples. The YCAP study, Health and Retirement Study, Regards, the Kaiser cohort. These are population representative random samples. That's where you're going to find the best research on Alzheimer's disease and cognitive aging disparities. Changing health behaviors and lifestyle choices will not eliminate disparities in dementia because we have fundamental social causes that drive these disparities. There's evidence that these life course social factors, most of them are patterned by structural racism, influence dementia risk and resilience. We need to collect population feasible biomarkers to determine the relative contribution and the ability of these structural and social factors to buffer neuropathology in terms of how it affects later life cognitive function. That's why I was showing you all those MRIs and those blood tests of Alzheimer's disease biomarkers. We can also show in the research that policies that repair intergenerational impact of racism and discrimination on wealth, investment in schools and teachers to increase educational quality, and funding to decrease neighborhood inequalities all have potential of narrowing disparities in cognitive aging and dementia. I want each of you to embrace the possibility that changing cognitive intercept, or the level of cognition that we go into older age with, is a path to increasing cognitive life expectancy, not just intervening on slope over time or decline over time. And that critical leadership by scientists that have not traditionally been included in dementia research, and I put the Black in Neuro logo here because it's a great organization to do this, is also critical for equitable Alzheimer's disease and dementia research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now we'll open up for question and answer, and I have a few questions to start off with.
Okay.
And then we have maybe 5 or 6 questions, and we have a few more. So some of these are fairly relate to what you said. Some a little tangential.
It's all right.
So like one, this is an early one. And this was from the graphic about the various risk factors for dementia, and does that include all dementias? And so, like Parkinson-related dementia.
It did. Okay. It did include all dementias, which is interesting because, obviously, y'all know there are many different types of dementia. How distinct they are, they can be distinguished clinically, and there's a lot of argument about whether how well they can be distinguished neuropathologically. So I'll leave it there, but yes, there are many different causes of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most prevalent cause of dementia, and as I said, in the United States, vascular dementia is like number 2.
Okay. Is there, I think that you mentioned environmental factors, like lead exposure or maybe exposure to lead and other toxins. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can talk about that a little bit, just that first I want to say that, what we need in order to study pollution and lead exposure and how it relates to Alzheimer's disease is we need longitudinal studies, right, that collect these data from the environment and then follow people over time. And there are some studies that, have collected residential history. So where were you born and raised? Where did you go to school all throughout your entire life? And then have Alzheimer's disease outcomes later in life. Health and retirement study is one of those. And that indicate that lead exposure during childhood increases risk for Alzheimer's disease later in life. We also have pollution studies, just in the YCAP study that I described to you in Northern Manhattan, that has shown that exposure to PM 2.5, or, like the bad big particles of pollution, is also does increase risk for later life dementia, incident dementia, over and above that, associated with any genetic risk factors.
Okay, thank you. Can you also just tell us about, again, just a clarification, you mentioned stroke belt.
Yeah.
And can you tell us, what is sort of the definition of the stroke belt?
Oh, no, you're going to make me tell you the stroke belt states?
No, not
Okay.
everyone, but
All
sort
right.
of just a little bit more detailed. Certainly not all of the states are. Or if you want
Yeah.
to, maybe I can add some information about that also.
Yeah, there's also the little bit of controversy about like whether Virginia is included or not, or people. But yes, I can also send this along. But Mississippi, Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina. So it's this sort of, Florida's not included,
Mhm.
but it's this belt of states throughout the South that have higher rates of stroke in both white and Black people.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though they're more rural, it goes across urban and rural lines. So that's essentially the definition.
Yeah. Yeah, because essentially it's the traditional, many of the traditional slave holding states
That's right.
are also considered stroke belt states. And
Hmm.
also that's where much higher percentage of African Americans live in
Yes,
stroke belt states. Yes.
that's right. That's right. But I think one of the things I wanted you to take away from that is that even if you move out of those states, you take your risk with you.
Hmm.
And that some of those findings, those state specific findings, had us thinking, well, okay, we know all those things that you said, Professor Taylor, but what about other early life risks? That's what got us onto this education thing.
Yes. And thank you. Getting to education. So can you just tell us why does why does low educational levels contribute to cognitive health decline?
Well, okay, that is sort of where my research is now. I think that in following these school-based cohorts, I'm going to be able to answer that question more definitively because I have people who were exposed to different types of educational, um, you know, uh, uh, educational settings. So people who were in big schools that were well funded, people who were in small schools that were well funded, people who were in schools in a stroke belt state that were integrated versus stroke belt state that was segregated, um, and differences in by county and by school related to how much investment was put in those schools and in those aspects. Like I talked about teacher training as being one of the strongest predictors. And so why is that? There's a whole lifetime of possible mediators, right?
Mhm.
What does it mean for a child that the teacher in the classroom has more training in the subject that they are teaching? It might mean that that teacher is more invested in the children themselves, giving more time to them, a better quality of instruction. It might mean that the peers around you are better prepared, and therefore the social ties between people in schools benefit everyone. It could also be a neighborhood level investment. I mean, where there are good schools, there's also some spillover into neighborhood and the other way around, obviously. So we're hoping that these policy differences will help us, understand not only the direction of the effect, the causality, but also what are some of the interventions that would really, improve later life cognition.
Yep. Thank you. What's fascinating also is sort of this combination of poor schools and poor, in the South traditionally and still has, puts a lot less money in education. And that combination of the stroke belt. And also, one of your major points is where the ARD, the Alzheimer's research centers are located.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes sense that they're less located in the poor areas where the schools aren't as good because they probably don't compete as well. But in the same way, that's where people are located. So it is a fascinating thing.
If equity were the basis of how these ADRCs were funded, we wouldn't have this, right? That took the back seat. What took the front seat was, this idea behind what is a good place to have an ADRC. And it's completely confounded with, whiteness. So that was what the point I was trying to make there.
Okay. Early on, again, in the early figure, one thing that was a pretty high percentage was hearing loss.
I know. Yeah.
Do you know anything? I know that's not quite your research, but can you illuminate on that a little bit?
A lot of people commented on that when they saw this paper. Keep in mind that part of why it was so big, perhaps, is that a lot of hearing loss is preventable and it's also common. So it may not have a very strong impact on dementia, but the fact that it is so modifiable and it's common probably made that circle a little bit higher. And I don't think that the causal links are quite there. But it was a systematic review. And we need to make one of those figures for each population. We need to make one of those figures for Black populations. We need to make one of those figures for Asian American populations. We need to know how modifiable each of those are. And there are probably things that are not even on there that we need to put on the figure as well and keep in mind.
Absolutely. So one thing you mentioned that was very important, but didn't receive a lot of attention, was measurement bias and cognitive testing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, that really was what I focused on in the early part of my career. I've now been doing this since I was a postdoc in 96 and then joined the faculty in 98. And in those early years, I really focused on, are these measures of memory, executive function, language, and so on, are they really fair across language groups, across racial and ethnic groups? And what we've done is essentially taken the measures and made sure that they are invariant across racial and ethnic groups. So most of the research that I showed you, the scores, the memory scores, and all of that are boiled down to items and to indicators that function in a way that's invariant across the racial and ethnic groups. So I'm just boiling down probably like 15 years of my life to just that sentence. But yeah, that is a big deal. And I told you that it was a big deal in that set of slides where I talked about the clinical trials. They're using one test, a logical memory test often, or a mini mental to set a cut. And if you score below that, you're out. You cannot be in the trial. And Black people are more likely to score below that cut, even though clinically and memory-wise, they're actually doing just as well as the white people who are above that cut. So fairness, measurement bias still plays a part in Alzheimer's disease research, and we have to remain vigilant. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah, thank you. Let me get back to hearing loss. And it's not a question per se, but just we have a comment that I think is important, and I'm not sure what audience members can see this, so I will just read it.
Mm-hmm.
Anecdotally, my patients with long-term hearing loss had become more socially isolated, less involved, less active due to their hearing loss. Also, because they weren't hearing everything that was said to them, it appeared that they didn't remember when they just didn't hear.
Yeah.
This applied to not only social interactions, but also interactions with medical providers, which affected their ability to comply with health directives.
I love that comment. That is right on, especially the social isolation piece. Now, there is a group of people out there that think that there's a common cause of hearing loss and dementia. In other words, hearing loss, that type of hearing loss that you're talking about, happens in the brain. And also they're saying that Alzheimer's disease, obviously happens in the brain,
Mm.
and it's the same neuropathology. I don't know about that. We're still at a beginning stage. The audience should look up the results of the ACHIEVE trial. It's a trial where they gave people high quality hearing aids. And it was housed in Johns Hopkins. And they did the trial in volunteers and also the ARIC cohort, ARIC. It's a community-based cohort of people who were recruited a long time ago, who were population representative. They found that there was no effect of giving the hearing aids in the community volunteers, but that the cognitive test scores did improve for the community representative people who were given the hearing aids. It was a very subtle improvement, but it was statistically significant. So I totally agree, though. The people in the trial, the effect that was massive was that the people in the trial who got these high quality hearing aids loved their hearing aids. They loved being able to take part in conversation. They loved being able to understand, what people were telling them in the doctor's office. They loved being able to hear all the things, the TV, the phone, and everything. And so it was definitely a beneficial interaction, and we should cover hearing aids of that quality in Medicare.
Yeah. So 2 or 3 points, and then there's 1 or 2 more questions from the audience. But Karen Lincoln yesterday mentioned one thing that was interesting that relates to your work, which is that a lot of that for her people her research participants, community participants in Southern California, the main reason why they found out that they didn't participate in research was because they were not asked.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that is exactly what we found also with our group in Detroit, with our Healthy Black Elders group, or Healthier. Then the second thing that I want to mention that I'm going to ask staff people to put in the chat relates to discrimination. So the discrimination measure was put together by David Williams and with also assistance with James Jackson while they were here at Michigan with the Program for Research in Black Americans. And we have a video that with David Williams and Harold Neighbors, discussing the origins of that measure. So we're going to share that in the chat.
Nice.
And that's a YouTube video.
Yeah. What an influential measure. I mean, we have much more to do in this area, but that has changed, like a lot of what, James and David Williams did, just really changed the face of research, of all types of research.
There is another comment on hearing loss, and again, it sort of says that says my experience with hearing loss clients has been significant and continual problems in relationship and learning experiences and the sense of self, especially if receiving the auditory device input later in life. So again, just a comment.
Yes.
Then here is another question about protective factors.
Okay.
And so, can you speak a little bit more about protective factors that enabled individuals from getting dementia despite showing signs of the disease on MRI test?
Mm-hmm. Well, education, years of school was actually the most sort of the factor that has been shown to promote this resilience or reserve more than any other factor out there. And what we found in our research is that that applies to our indicators of educational quality as well. So both quantity, right, which is in the end kind of an outcome. If you get high quality early life education, you're more likely to go further in school and get more years. And so that what I can tell you is the number one sort of, factor that promotes that gap, that widens that gap. People can live with more neuropathology in their brain for longer.
Mm-hmm.
Are these educational experience variables. We also had the opportunity to look explicitly at literacy. We have a group of people who mostly were born in the Caribbean and who did not have any formal schooling because none was available.
Yeah.
And some know how to read and write, not great, but they know the basics of reading and writing, and others do not. We were able to show that people, even with these basics of literacy, they're all low literacy, but they do have literacy. People with literacy were also able to withstand more of the neuropathology later in life, despite having MRI signs of neurodegeneration, independent of years of school. Mm-hmm. So those are just two I'll mention now. There are others. People have looked at social isolation, or in the flip side, social support.
Yeah.
People have also, Laura Zahodny at University of Michigan is looking at experiences of discrimination and found that people who experience more discrimination are actually have less of this buffer. So the evidence sort of continues to pile on that there are these income. I should have said that. That's another big one. Mm-hmm. The higher your income, not only throughout your life, but in later life, the more reserve or resilience you have against neuropathology.
Okay, thank you. So this might not be a fair question, or maybe a tougher question, because when we do research from looking at immigrants, it's hard to know give a reason. We have a finding, but sometimes I personally don't want to speculate too much because it becomes too much speculation. But you had mentioned earlier in a study about people coming from Cuba.
Yeah.
Being protective. Any ideas about that?
So my idea is that the educational system, sorry, I'm kind of a one-track mind person, but I do know that the educational system in Cuba, despite it, being limited, that 8 years of school was really the compulsory level, but the quality of those 8 years was really high, much higher than in the Dominican Republic, where the compulsory school level was 6 years, but the quality of those schools was sort of structurally really messed with, right? So there was a dictator there who really felt that in order to keep the rural people in their place, education could not be good. And that was Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Now, the leadership in Cuba at the time that our participants were there did not have such a strong gap in the rural versus the urban education, and put investment into those years of school, even in the rural schools. I think that New York Cubans are different than Florida Cubans. That's for sure. Like they came here at different times and for different reasons. But the educational system is probably what's accounting for that.
Well, we're going to let that be the last question. Dr. Manley, we are extremely pleased and delighted that you were able to come here today and give this great presentation. We're really grateful to the Winkelman family who has provided the funds for this over maybe 30 to maybe 40, 50-year period now. And the type of research that you do is just simply critical for aging African Americans and aging in general, because again, one of the major findings is that increases in levels of education were the most helpful to white women in terms of dementia. And so it shows, and we see that a lot, that research on African Americans, although people may consider restricted to that population, helps out everybody.
Yep.
So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for always being an advocate for this work. And thank you for your work. And it was an honor to speak with all of you.
Again, thank you.